Hi everyone, welcome to Heretics Corner. I'm Obaid Omer, and with me is Dean. Unfortunately, Nulli is still not able to join us. Today we have a special guest on. He goes by Covert Fade, and he's the host of the JW Forecast. It's a podcast for ex-Jehovah's Witnesses and issues dealing with Jehovah's Witnesses. Thank you very much for joining us, Covert. Really glad to have you on.
Hey guys, thanks ever so much for having me on. Looking forward to it.
So we kind of try to focus on what different apostates from different faiths go through and similarities and differences to kind of show that, any extreme faith of any kind can be harmful and, they have similar effects on people. So if you wouldn't mind just going to a bit of your background and a bit of your history and, like how you came to leave being a Jehovah's Witness, and then we can maybe start discussing the religion and some of those things.
Certainly. So I was actually born into the Jehovah's Witnesses. My parents were Jehovah's Witnesses and their parents before them. So there was a kind of, I'm what they would call third generation. Interestingly enough, despite all of their kind of Jehovah's Witnesses are known very much for their preaching, and they're trying to kind of get new recruits that way. But most Jehovah's Witnesses are actually born in nowadays because the preaching work isn't doing very well. So I was born in. And I kind of accepted the Jehovah's Witness life and all the teachings as being truth because they were presented to me as the absolute truth from day one. What happened with me is like gradually over the years, I just kind of got this gradual accumulation of questions and doubts and things that didn't just sit correctly for me. It was never with any of the major teachings, but there was always just little problems and little things I would notice, and I thought, well, if we're the pure and true religion, it's strange that we do this or we think this. And it all kind of gathered until there was actually I had this huge weight of problems and doubts. And then what happened was I came across a few instances in my life where I reached out to what are called in Jehovah's Witnesses, we call them the elders. So they're kind of the men in charge of the religion. So each congregation will have a number of elders, usually between 5 and 10, and they're kind of the spiritual leaders. And I reached out to them for help, and I got exactly the opposite of help. I got a very unkind, a very unfeeling, and a kind of, for want of a better word, a kind of useless response to all my questions and to the problems I was facing. And I was so upset by that. And that kind of married with all of the kind of these accumulations of doubts over other things about doctrine that I had for like 20 years. I gave myself permission to go and actually research the religion for the first time, because Jehovah's Witnesses are told, do not research your religion outside of our publications. So you're free to look at what we say. And obviously we say we're true, and we'll give you all the evidence that proves we're true. But you're basically more or less told, don't go and look at the counter arguments. Well, I went and looked at the counter arguments. And one of the key things for me was the Jehovah's Witnesses have a book called Life, How Did It Get Here by Evolution or Creation? And it's supposed to be kind of their definitive answer as to why science backs the biblical creation narrative and not the narrative of evolution. And I actually went and found out that all of the scientists they quoted to support themselves, there's so many kind of misquotes or falsely attributed quotes, or basically downright manipulative twistings of what people actually said. That was for me kind of the first major blow, because this book, Life, How Did It Get Here by Evolution or Creation, for me was proof that my faith was scientifically sound, that the Genesis account was scientifically sound. And so to see that blown out of the water, and also to see that the faith I followed had behaved in such a kind of underhanded and obviously manipulative way in the way that they'd handled the scientific data and the science they quoted, that was kind of the proton torpedo into the exhaust port of the Death Star for me. And everything else just crumbled. I kind of went online, I researched everything. And now, thankfully, there's a very large ex-JW community online, which you can find fairly easily if you Google. And they're very helpful at supplying all the information. There's a website called jwfacts.com, which is created by a guy called Paul Grundy, that exhaustively debunks all the JW teachings, and he references everything. He's got references you can check and links you can follow. There's websites like JW Survey, which was founded by Lloyd Evans. And I kind of now work with Lloyd on JW Survey, and he's got his YouTube channel on John Cedars. There's this huge wealth of ex-JW material. And I kind of drank all this in like a man who spent 3 years in the desert finally finding an oasis. And within 2 weeks, I was like, I'm done. I'm done with this religion. The problem I had, and this is probably one of the things we'll discuss, is that the Jehovah's Witnesses have a very strict policy of shunning. So in theory, and again, we'll probably discuss this, in theory, you shouldn't be able to leave the religion without being shunned. They don't call it shunning. They call it disfellowshipping or disassociation. So if you are disfellowshipped, that means they caught you doing something you're not supposed to do. And for Jehovah's Witnesses, that list kind of stretches to Pluto and back. Sorry, after you.
No, this is all sounding very familiar. As Muslims, like that soft cultural control that happens. No music, no movies, and if I don't know, just like if you start doing things that are sort of considered anti-Islamic, people start to softly kind of push you away, and then as opposed to the hard, rejection that happens if you actually leave the faith. So there's sort of a build up towards the actual punishment.
Yeah, there's a very similar thing in Jehovah's Witnesses in that you have both the hard punishments but also the social control. So even if you're not completely breaking the laws, if you're skirting close to it, or if you're doing things that are not forbidden but they're considered to be unwise, you'll have the same thing. People will kind of just start drawing away from you. And you'll find that you're not getting invited to parties, or people are kind of whispering behind your back, or the elders will be kind of calling on you to sort of say that we're worried. So yeah, it's a very similar thing.
Just touching on that, actually. Now, I mean, again, I don't know how much of what I've heard is conjecture or just rumors or whatever. One of the weird things I'd heard, and then I want to get into like something a little more serious, but I have to know if this is true or not. Mm-hmm. The way I had it explained to me at one point was that heaven has a finite number of places to let people in. So it kind of works like a pyramid scheme. So the more people you convert, the higher up you go. Something along those lines?
So not quite. So the doctrine is the JWs have kind of they come from Christianity, and they have a lot of ideas that people would recognize as Christian, but they also have their own unique spins on things. And this comes from the idea, and I'm going to have to lay out a bit more of the doctrine for this to make sense, but it won't take too long. The idea with Jehovah's Witnesses is there's two classes of faithful people. There's a small group called the 144,000, and they will all get to go to heaven after they die. For the rest of them, and this also includes most Jehovah's Witnesses, well, this is basically all the Jehovah's Witnesses, they don't get to go to heaven. But the belief is that any moment now, God's going to bring Armageddon. He's going to kill everyone who isn't a Jehovah's Witness, and all the Jehovah's Witnesses get to survive, and they get to live forever on the earth. So God's going to give everyone who survives who's a Jehovah's Witness eternal life. They get to live forever on the earth. But the 144,000 who are like a very small select group of Jehovah's Witnesses, and they also say like people from the first century, so people who were Christians in the first century, they say some of those as well, they get to go to heaven. Now, the weird thing with this is the way you know that you're one of the 144,000 is if you say you are. So you don't kind of – the idea is God's Spirit will reach out to you and just magically appoint you, and you will have this surge of like, yes, I'm going to heaven, I'm not going to stay on earth. What my own experience of this is that I met a few of the people who they're called the anointed. And I met a few of people who claimed to be anointed when I was a Jehovah's Witness. And some of them were perfectly pleasant people, and some of them were absolutely crazy. And the problem they have is that more and more people now are saying, oh, I'm anointed, I'm going to heaven. And the numbers aren't starting to add up because there's only supposed to be 144,000 places. And they've actually started publishing articles now in their religious journals saying, well, some people might be crazy when they say this, so we can't take everyone at face value. And it's so funny to see them backtracking on it.
So is it one of these things where like basically there's no method for testing it? People just say they are, and that's it?
Yeah, there's absolutely no quality control. And people basically, you're not supposed to challenge someone. So if someone says I am, then you have to admit it. You have to say, okay, you must be, unless they're kind of doing, things that Jehovah's Witnesses aren't supposed to do. But assuming they're following the rules and they say, I am anointed, I'm one of the 144,000, you have to accept it, even if that person is demonstrably out of their tree crazy.
Yeah, it sounds
so
bizarre. It sounds like the opposite of gaslighting, kind of like trying to convince people. I don't know. Like, I think the closest thing I can think of in Islam is, in Islam, there's this concept that Muhammad said, if you see me in a dream, it cannot be Satan. It cannot be anything but me. And so I've met people who are convinced that they've seen Muhammad in dreams. And, that's their proof that, they were on the right path, for example.
Wow.
They're doing the right thing in their lives. And often, like I remember even as a Muslim thinking that seems so like subjective. Like and the things they would describe sometimes would be completely not how I would expect Muhammad to be. And it's like, I don't know, it just seems so like there are red flags going off in my head. Like you said, like it sounds insane sometimes.
Yeah, because a dream is such a kind of a weird landscape of what's going on in your brain and random stuff, and it must be. It's like I saw Muhammad, so it cannot be Satan, and you're thinking to yourself, yeah, but yesterday I dreamed I was a block of cheese, so I don't know how reliable your dream might be.
Yeah, and it's just like these people seem so ordinary a lot of the time. Like you just think, wait, I know that guy's smoking weed behind the like after prayers. Like I don't know, like I don't want to say he's lying, but maybe he thinks it. I don't know.
Yeah, also,
it's like.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, I suspect a lot of people aren't lying. It's just that they have an experience that they take to mean a certain thing, whereas it's there isn't really any objective proof that it was that thing. I think there was a great
And sorry, go ahead.
After you guys.
I was just going to say, like, especially when they've been sort of waiting for that to happen, when they're wanting it to happen, people literally pray for years and years and years. Please, Allah, let me see Muhammad in my dreams. Let me see my beloved prophet in my dreams. And then eventually it happens. No surprise there if you're like an atheist or non-religious person looking at it, going, well, you made it happen because your dream is completely. Everything's it's based on whatever your mind invents. So like it was almost inevitable in a sense. So there's that factor as well. It's quite bizarre. And sorry, I cut you off.
Well, no, it's a very good point, because I think it's how often I think a lot of these things work. I know that I've done because one of the things I did when I left the Jehovah's Witnesses was I looked into kind of all these reports of the paranormal and ghosts and things like that. And it's fascinating to find out that often people who say they've had experiences with, spirits and stuff, it's not that they're lying, but what's happened is that they've been in a certain situation in a suggestible state. They've just woken up, or something's happened, or they've been like emotionally in a very, very intense, or something's been going on with them to put them in a very intense, slightly suggestible state. And then something's happened that they've and then something's happened that they've interpreted. And so when they say, I saw my mother sitting at the bottom of the bed and she smiled, they're not lying. They might have had an experience like when they were waking up, when they were halfway between a dream, and that made them see that. But that doesn't mean that that's what happened. It means that the human brain is this amazing thing that when it gets into strange states and has weird stimulus, it does things that can seem to us like supernatural events. But if you actually look at what was going on in your brain and the things you were thinking about, and like maybe even thinking about your dead mother for a while because you missed her, and then it's dark and your brain pattern recognizes, because it doesn't like, we see shapes in clouds and things like that. And it's fascinating to see. So, and when you were saying like all these people, it's like, I don't necessarily think people are always lying when they say they've had these experiences. I think they're being genuine, but the experience they're having can be explained through scientific means.
Totally.
Yeah, exactly. But it makes me sad that like people make decisions based on that. In Islam, there's a concept of if you're going to make a big decision in your life, what course to get into, who to marry, for example, people do certain prayers and they wait for they do it at night, and then the next morning, depending on if they had like a positive or negative dream, they base their entire life decisions on weird things like that. And I've seen it go wrong for people, where they married the wrong person based on like they didn't know the person, their parents suggested they get married, and they did the prayer, got married, ended up divorced due to abuse like a couple of years later.
Oh no.
And they just, it's just sad. Anyway.
Yeah, like I said, there's also one other thing I was just kind of curious about. I just wanted to bring up, because we're talking about social pressures earlier, and like now I'm not sure if I have this right, because I know that they do this with Mormons, I believe, but like everything, and this was from a course I took back in university, so it's it's like 20 plus years of haze, but it was it was a psychology course, and the professor was talking about a Jehovah's Witness family that had come in, but he was mentioning that like once a week everything is discussed like within the community about everyone else. So he was talking about, it was actually about a teenage boy who just started discovering his body, and the parents were all freaked out, and so so that was was discussed in like like you said with the elders and stuff and the rest of the community, that he was masturbating. So I mean, like how you have that in Islam in some extent, like you don't go and speak to the mosque, but the community is so close knit in some places, and everyone's always worried about what the other person's doing, and most of the thing is, okay, we can't do this because what will the neighbors say, type of thing, right? So is that even amplified even more in Jehovah's Witnesses, or am I completely off base on that?
No, you're accurate. I mean, what you're talking about there is there's no official policy where they gather everyone in the congregation together and say, right, but there kind of is. They like what they would have. The first thing is all the elders would find out. If you have a problem and you go to the elders, all the elders will know about it. Now, they're supposed to keep things confidential, but my experience of Jehovah's Witnesses is they'll tell their family, and then, quite often their family will talk to everyone else, so it will get round. There isn't supposed to be officially a forum where they get together and point at someone and say, he's been doing this, and let's all kind of as a congregation judge them. But what happens is there's two things. If there's like if let's say, like, sort of Tim's been masturbating and he gets caught, and the elders think, we need to say something about the fact because people are masturbating, they will have what they call a local needs talk. So at their religious gatherings, they'll have like a guy, they're basically like a series of people getting up on a platform and doing a series of talks. They'll have someone get up there, and it's called a local needs item. And they might talk about something. And if they start talking about masturbation on a local needs item, somebody's been out there choking the chicken, and it's kind of got round. Or if they talk about fornication, and then there's two people looking embarrassed, everyone will know who it is. And people tend to know anyway, because it is an insular community, and insular communities, things get out. The other thing they might do is what's called a marking talk. And this is kind of like ratcheting the tension up one more. So this is when someone's been doing things that we can't officially punish you for, but we think they're so bad, we're going to make an example of you. They will describe a behavior in great detail. So let's talk about masturbation. They'll talk about masturbation in great detail, or they'll talk about, I'm trying to think of the other things you could be marked for. They tend to be things that are not disfellowshipable offences, but they're not things they can let slide. And then they will say, after you.
No, you go ahead.
I was going to say, and then they will say, and if you know anybody like this, you should minimize your association with them. And because it's a Jehovah's Witness congregation, everybody will know who they're talking about. And what they're saying is that person should not be invited as much to social gatherings. You shouldn't hang out with them. You shouldn't invite them around their house. We can't tell you to completely shun them because they haven't done anything shun-worthy, but we've kind of given them a tick mark that says they're teetering on the edge. So that's I imagine that's what the psychologist was referring to. So there isn't like a forum where everyone gets around, points at a person, and like publicly washes all the laundry. But you kind of get the same effect with those things because it's such an insular congregation. Everyone kind of knows.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's a very common theme in Islam as well, where isolation and the whole social the community is being tight knit, becomes turned against you in that way. And I was going to say, I've got an aunt who used to be part of the Jehovah's Witnesses, like she was born into it. And she actually left the country and fled her family, like sort of like years ago. I don't know the full details, but she like whenever I ask her about it, she says, it's cultish. It's they shun you for like the slightest things. Things like listening to music, playing video games, or the wrong music, the wrong movies.
Yeah, if you do the wrong stuff, that's when you start to get in trouble. They are allowed to like listen to music and watch films, but they are very restrictive. And depending where you are in the world, and this is one of the slightly weird things with Jehovah's Witnesses, there isn't a huge variation because no matter where you go, they're pretty much a cult. But you can get away with some things in it like that you couldn't in others. Like I was allowed to watch the Lord of the Rings films in the UK where I was, which was fine, and everybody watched it and enjoyed them. Apparently in the US, if you watch the Lord of the Rings, you get grabbed by the back of the collar and lectured, and it's the same with Harry Potter. So there's a degree of variation.
I was going to say it's probably Harry Potter as well with in terms of reading books, because half my family teaches at Islamic schools, and pretty much all the Islamic schools ban Harry Potter because it's witchcraft. It's encouraging witchcraft.
Yeah, exactly the same with Jehovah's Witnesses. They don't mention Harry Potter by name, but they'll talk about books that feature children who are wizards, and it's like, well, how many of those are there?
So and also with the isolation thing, my aunt mentioned that growing up in the Jehovah's Witnesses, she was heavily discouraged from making friends outside of the Jehovah's Witness group. It was sort of like a self-regulation thing where when she went to school or whatever, she'd or like whoever she made friends with, she was discouraged from making friends with non-Jehovah's Witnesses, which is very, very common in Islam as well. There's stories of the Prophet where he said you should keep your whoever your friends are, you will become, and so you shouldn't make friends with non-believers. And that's a heavily sort of encouraged in the Muslim community, that children don't make friends outside of Islam.
It's very similar in the Jehovah's Witnesses as well. It's very isolating because I think one of the things is if you only surround yourself with people who share your worldview, you'll become quite narrow-minded. As a Jehovah's Witness growing up, I had that exact experience. I had friends who were at school, but I wasn't supposed to go around their house after school. I was supposed to minimize my association, and they do the same if you're at work. So if you've met a Jehovah's Witness and you work with a Jehovah's Witness, they're probably perfectly pleasant people at work because many of them are really nice people. And that's the tragedy. I look at it, there's so many nice people, but they're trapped in this awful kind of cultish religion. But if you invite them out after work, some of them will say yes, but they're probably the ones who are kind of a bit rebellious. Most of them will probably find a reason not to go. And they won't say, I can't associate with you because you're not a Jehovah's Witness. They'll find a reason, but the reality is because you're not a Jehovah's Witness, they've got to. The phrase they use is bad associations spoil useful habits. And it's a scripture from somewhere in Paul in the Bible.
That sounds
they really hit that hard. Bad associations spoil useful habits. And if you read some of their literature, it's basically almost Orwellian in the way that they virtually admit that if you talk to someone who doesn't share your beliefs, they might change your ideas about things, and that's a bad thing. And when I was a Jehovah's Witness, I was like, yeah, that sounds reasonable. And looking at it now, I'm just like, oh my God. But yeah, it's quite strong.
Yeah. Getting back to the insular thing, I just, a couple of weeks ago, I'd heard a Hasidic Jewish person talking about this. And it's not exactly the same in Muslim communities in the West, but he was talking about, let's say you're in a Hasidic Jewish community, a couple get into a fight, and the husband punches the wife. Mm-hmm. They have their own kind of community policing and their own ambulances and stuff, even though that the city and all that provided, obviously, but they'll be taken quickly to a hospital, admitted, and then it'll all be put down that they just fell down the stairs. So is there things like that? Let's say parents are abusing a child, or like in Islam, a woman cannot refuse it's considered impossible for a husband to rape his wife, right? So, they won't even consider that. So, is it something like that as well, like where everything's kind of tried to keep out of the authorities?
Yeah. Absolutely. In fact, this is one of the major issues that we're dealing with as ex-Jehovah's Witnesses and as activists. Is particularly, I mean, domestic violence is an issue as well, but the child abuse issue is massive. And there's a specific reason that's unique to the Jehovah's. I don't know if it's unique to them, but it's what's causing the problem. If your listeners are interested in finding out in gruesome detail how bad this is, Australia, they recently had a royal commission into all various institutions and religions in 2015, and they did a case study 29 Jehovah's Witnesses. And you can find the testimony on YouTube, and you can look into it on the website, the Royal Commission website. But the Jehovah's Witnesses, they have their own internal judicial system. So the way I tend to describe it to people is they kind of have their own Sharia courts. So if there's an accusation, it really should. I mean, they officially, Jehovah's Witnesses will say, "Oh, we always contact the police," and the individual witnesses will sometimes. But what will happen is that if I find out a child's being abused, it should go to the elders first. The elders will then call the Watchtower branch, and the Watchtower will officially, if by law they're mandated to report, they say they will, but they've just been fined $35 million in Montana in the US for a situation where they were required to report and they didn't. And this is actually, the reality is they don't report. They want to keep it dead quiet. Instead, they hand it over to their own judicial, they call it a judicial committee, but it's 3 untrained elders who will sit down, question a child sex abuse victim. They've got no training, so they're dealing with an extremely vulnerable person, and they kind of blunder in with no training at all. They'll also question the accused molester. So again, they're like got no training in this. Then they'll come to a decision. But one of the problems they have is they say they're bound by scriptural rules. And one of those is something called the 2-witness rule, which is taken from the Leviticus law code that was given to the Jews that said you had to have 2 witnesses for someone to be found guilty of anything. So if there are not 2 witnesses, they can say 1 witness can be the child, but if there's not a corroborating witness, scripture, they can't do anything about it. So they will just basically let that accusation fly. And even if they do find 2 witnesses, they might reprove that person. And there's been many examples where a child molester's basically been slapped on the wrist because he said he was sorry. Or they might disfellowship them, but then let them back in a couple of years later. And at no point do they notify the police or law enforcement. Now, sometimes it does happen. So if an individual Jehovah's Witness does go to the police and make a report, they won't necessarily be in trouble. But what they've found is time and time again, like in the Royal Commission, they had people saying, well, of course you can report to the police, but do you really want to bring shame on Jehovah's name? Do you really want to do that? Can't we just handle this in the community? And so you will find situations where there was a JW child abuser and the police were called and the person went to prison. You will find that. But you'll find a lot of situations where that didn't happen. And it was either because of explicit Watchtower policy in that we're not going to report it, or because they only had 1 of 2 witnesses, so they didn't report it, or they kind of dealt with it in their internal court, but the punishment was a slap on the wrist. It was what they call a reproof. And then 2 years later, the abuser, raped another child. I think in Australia, they found this is a population, I think there's 36,000 witnesses. They found since 1950 there had been over 1,006 abusers, none of whom were reported to the police by the witnesses, some of whom were repeat offenders. And it actually worked out, if you broke the statistics down, all congregations in Australia would have had 1 abuser, and many of them would have had 2. And that's the only country in the world where they've gone in with this investigation and done this statistical breakdown. But from the other bits of information we have been able to glean from court cases and other sources, it seems like that's not unrepresentative for Jehovah's Witnesses worldwide.
Yeah, I was going to say my aunt from when she said that after she left the Jehovah's Witnesses and that was in New Zealand and she moved to Australia, she heard about families that she grew up with. The news was coming out that a lot of the kids had been abused and there were cases where there was actual sexual abuse that had been hidden by the elders, and no police had been involved. Very similar to exactly what you're describing, and this was in New Zealand.
Yeah,
So it sounds like it's something global, and
it is. Yeah,
it's
and
terrible.
it's sorry, after you.
No. It just seems horrible to have that kind of thing happening and be mandated by scripture.
Yeah.
The, the amount of guilt those kids must feel, the amount of the way it must feel to be trapped in that environment.
Well, one of the tragedies that's come out of it is what's happened, and this is something that was identified by the Royal Commission, who talked to they talked to hundreds of ex-JW abuse survivors. Very frequently, these children are abused, so they're left with massive psychological damage. They're not believed. They're left in the congregation, but then because they're trying to deal with all the pain, they'll do something like become rebellious or go to drink or drugs, or they'll do something that breaks the JW rules. So then they're thrown out and shunned. And there are, it's not uncommon to hear of ex-JW suicides, and it doesn't take a genius to kind of link all the paths. So you've got the abuser gets a slap on the wrist, nothing happens to them, but the victim's thrown out and shunned because they smoked a cigarette.
That's
so
yeah, I mean, and also, okay, like talking about the child abuse and the sexual or otherwise. Now, what, 2 billion Catholics around the world, and these things started coming to light in the early 2000s, and then with all this stuff recently. But was it 1997? A letter was sent out to all the Irish bishops saying, "Do not talk about this outside the church." And I can't remember the exact term, but it was sealed to something. And then in 2001, I believe, or 2002, when Ratzinger was still a cardinal before he became pope, he was the prefect of the Order of the Congregation of the Faith. So basically what the Inquisition became. And he wrote a letter to all bishops saying, on pain of excommunication. And that was sealed to, I think that was called sealed to the pontiff. So you had to have papal permission before you talked about it outside. And that letter, I mean, he on pain of excommunication, do not talk to anyone outside the church about the child abuse. So, I mean, the Catholic Church is, it's not a closed community like any other religion. I mean, obviously there is some insularity there, but not to the extent of like where Islam or Jehovah's Witnesses or Mormons or Hasidic or Orthodox Jews are. And that was covered up. I mean, from 2001 until now, when this thing broke in Pennsylvania, and all those reports coming out from all around the world now, 18 years they were able to keep that quiet. So, like I said, I see it from some parts from Islam, but there's nothing really codified. But then, like communities like that, like.
Well, I mean, definitely, it hasn't in modern times been an issue where I think because Islam doesn't have that kind of structure exactly. It's not like your local sheikh answers to anyone in particular, and so they just leave it to the local authorities to deal with these kind of things. Whereas I guess in areas where in Muslim countries you do end up having plenty of abuse happening, and it's just the norm. But here in the West, obviously, for the most part, it's not something that Muslims talk about. But at the same time, we just heard. I just saw in the news that Sinead O'Connor, some celebrity singer, converted to Islam because she used to be a devout Catholic, but the child sex abuses in the Catholic church shook her so much that for some reason she converted to Islam. And the first thing I'm thinking is, but Muhammad was a pedophile. Like,
I was going to say, has anyone told her about Muhammad's 9-year-old wife?
Okay, but
he explicitly molested children.
Okay, let's just the Sinead O'Connor thing. She had been anti-Christian or anti-Catholic for a long time. She got into trouble, and I remember watching this live in the 80s, on Saturday Night Live. So it was in the late 80s. She got up and she famously ripped up a picture of the Pope and said, "Fight the power," and then she just. She was supposed to sing a song, but then she just sang "War" by Bob Marley, and then she got into a lot of trouble about that. And then, I mean, she'd become an ordained minister of some kind recently, and it wasn't obviously Catholic. But then I know she'd spent some time in mental institutions. And I don't want to say because she converted to Islam, she's not mentally stable. But if you look back at her, especially in the last few years,
yeah,
she doesn't seem terribly stable. But like, I don't want to say that's the reason she converted. But yeah, but like the going back to the Muhammad thing, like, okay, and that's, I say it too, and I'm trying to stop myself from bringing that up. And it's not that because, okay, yes, he married Aisha when she was 6, had sex with her when she was 9. There are instructions on how to divorce your wives who are prepubescent if you hadn't had sex with them yet. There's a specific set of instructions on how to. So it's set up in there, but I don't like saying so much that I'm not saying that he didn't have sex slaves that were young. I'm sure he did. I'm not, but it was a pedophilic act. But at the same time, at that time, I think it's wrong to have him.
I know what you're saying.
It's wrong to have him as
it's just a lot of Muslims defend it, and
because
I
of him.
I guess the point is there's potential for
because of him. But like I'm saying, like you can say that following his example in that is a bad thing currently, but to call him a pedophile, he's a pedophile by today's standards. But if you get, and I don't want to give him any excuse or cover any shade or anything like that, but if you go back, like, it was a common practice, even though 6 years old was not common back then. But it did happen.
It's an example of a practice that we quite rightly look down on today as being terrible, but at the time, human beings didn't have the same. We hadn't we hadn't sort of like progressed as a species, so there was lots of that going around all over the world, and it was accepted. I mean, they did it in the medieval Europe as well. You'd marry off very young princesses.
And to have that as your basis of the perfect human being, and we have to follow his example, then you get laws like in Iran where 9 years old is the legal age to get married.
Yeah, exactly. And it's also like this soft-cultural sort of expectation. In a lot of Muslim environments, people happily talk about how I don't think 13 is too young. Like that, it's just a matter of being inappropriate for modern standards. But it's fine. Like if a 13-year-old married a 55-year-old, there's no there's nothing wrong with the power dynamic there. And I've been part of these conversations, and I don't know. It's just I think it has a soft cultural influence in people's minds. The fact that the greatest man on earth, so-called, his one of his deepest loves in his life was to a child. It fucks with people, I think.
Well, there's a video you can find on YouTube, and it's a sheikh talking about this, and he said, well, different women mature sexually at different times. So if a 6-year-old girl is sexually mature, they can be quite attractive. Like, it's just so creepy.
Yeah. Oh, good grief.
Ooh. I know. Dear. It's just like how you can say that is beyond me.
Oh dear.
But anyways,
it's just not good. Let's leave it at that.
Yeah. So we should get back to the subject at hand, because we could talk about the other stuff for hours.
Yeah.
So, okay, aside from the seclusion and stuff like that, and I mean, okay, obviously, I think due to the fact that since 9/11, Islam has become so prominent, and there's so much discussion of it, because I mean, we're kind of, shown it, maybe not so much at a daily basis anymore, but it was at one point in the last few years. It was getting ridiculous.
Mm.
Do you feel that, I mean, I know you've mentioned some resources for ex-Jehovah's Witnesses and stuff like that, but do you feel that there's a lack of exposure of other faiths with these kind of issues, and due to the coverage, and you don't hear about Jehovah's Witnesses suicide bombers, so you're not going to get the the flashy coverage for things like that. But do you feel that there's okay, people are talking about Islam now, but they're not talking about other faiths, and it would be more helpful to have the discussion along the lines of, okay, well, you know what, we'll have an, like, not an interfaith conference, but an inter-ex-faith conference, let's say, where you have everyone from different faiths who've left come together and they kind of have a cohesive
Well,
force?
there's kind of a little bit of that happening right now. I mean, I do agree that I think there's less exposure than there should be of groups like the Jehovah's Witnesses, but I think that that's changing. I mean, Scientology is kind of the test bed for this. That in the past few years, Scientology has been kind of got a massive amount of exposure and continues to do so. And one of the crossovers that's actually happened, and this show I believe is going out in November 15th, is that the Leah Remini's who did all the Scientology in the aftermath. She's actually doing a special on Jehovah's Witnesses, and that came about because so many ex-Jehovah's Witnesses watched Scientology in the aftermath. Were like, oh my God, the mechanisms, the way Scientology operates, is basically Jehovah's Witnesses. They just change the names for things. And so they contacted Leah Remini, and she basically and her team went off, researched this, and were like, yeah, we want to do a special. So that's an example, I think, of how that sort of thing is starting to happen. I mean, I'd love to see more of it. You do often get the weird thing I've seen. There seems to be a very close relationship between ex-Scientologists and ex-Jehovah's Witnesses, and you'll find them. For me, one of the first other ex-cults I encountered was Scientology. And I don't know why that is, but you'll see a lot of collaborations and crossovers between ex-Jehovah's Witnesses and ex-Scientology activists. I think the interesting thing is it's the underlying mechanisms by which they all operate. So you mentioned how in you've got social control, and then there's like shunning or forms of being cut off, and then there's ways of like forbidding people to read outside information that is critical of the faith. And these appear to be commonalities between all these different groups and, extreme versions of religions. And I think there's a guy called Stephen Hassan who wrote a book called Combating Cult Mind Control. And he identified the BITE model, BITE, which stands for behavioral control, information control, thought control, and emotional control. And if you read that book, and I'd recommend that, it's really good. You kind of read through it and you see so many aspects of your former religion in there. And I think it's good to identify individual organizations and faiths, and I wish we did more of it. And one of the problems you have is that despite all the exposure now that Jehovah's Witnesses are getting, it's still actually really hard to get governments and journalists interested in Jehovah's Witnesses. Like there's a child abuse investigation, a government child abuse investigation going on in the UK right now, ICSA. They've even had like journalists asking them if they're going to investigate Jehovah's Witnesses because of all the scandals in other countries, and ICSA apparently have just not been that interested in it. But I think maybe one of the things we can do is really, as a society, focus on these harmful behavior controls, because no matter what the organization is called, chances are if they're acting in a way that is harmful and controlling, they'll be kind of like ticking off boxes on something like the BITE model. And so I wonder if one of the ways forward is not only, I mean, I agree, it's great for ex-Muslims and ex-Witnesses and ex-Scientologists and ex-Moonies and ex-Children of God and all these other cults. It's good if they can all come together and work together. But I think also as a society, it'd be good for us to just develop an awareness of what these control mechanisms are. And so that if you encounter an organization that's like, oh yeah, if you leave that organization, they punish you for it. Red flags just, explode like the bridge of the Enterprise under attack. It's just like the red alert goes on. And so I wonder if those are maybe like a dual-pronged approach we need. It's like they're definitely the crossover between all the X's, and maybe if there was like some kind of ability to do that. Although one of the thoughts I did have, and I don't know if you found this, is that when you first leave a religion, you assume that everyone who's left is kind of like you and you can get on with them. What I've found in the XJW community is that no, the reality is that for many people, the only thing you have in common with them is that you used to be in that religion, but everything else is different. And so it can be quite hard to it's almost like herding cats. It's very hard to get like one big group that's all unified and doing stuff. And that doesn't mean you can't get that. And it doesn't mean you can't have productive conversations and collaborations and joined up team efforts on things.
Yeah, no.
But I think the idea maybe of there being one big forum, I don't know if that would work as well.
Yeah, no, I understand that, but it does happen in Islam as well, where it's okay when you're together and you're in the faith, and even though there's obviously there's plenty of sectarian violence in Islam, but you're in any community, so you're in a Sunni community and South Asian Sunni community, let's just say, so all the people from that community. You all believe the same thing. You all believe the same way. So that's your commonality. But once you leave, and someone might say, okay, well, I was denied alcohol and sex and drugs and they're going to completely debauch themselves for a few years. Someone else was like, I was denied science, and they're going to become a scholar or whatever. So it's you've lost the one thing that made you cohesive. Now the one thing that you have in common is you've all left it, but you don't have that cohesiveness. So I could see where, unfortunately, there is strength in that unity that they had, right? It's but
you can't quite fill that void of that community with another equal community, because no such thing exists, because that community you were part of was kind of forced to begin with.
It's almost like everyone was kind of compressed, like a bunch of springs that were all compressed down into one shape by force and by enforcement. And once you release that enforcing power, everyone kind of becomes the people they were always supposed to be. Everyone kind of springs back into their natural shape. And some of those natural shapes would they should never be in the same room with each other, because they were.
But I think especially with in terms of the ex-Muslim community, I found that there is a lot of differences, but we still manage to get along enough to, I trust a lot of the ex-Muslims in the Melbourne group, like more than I do my own family to some extent. Suddenly, in terms of talking about how I feel about things, and just learning how to live life without religion, like there's no one else I can turn to except for them. So I think in some ways you certainly need a community, but it's not going to fill that void completely, and that needs to be something that's a personal journey. Certainly to some degree it has to be part of your personal.
And like for like the way I kind of look at it is, I mean, people they're trying to fill a void, and as much as I rail against it, religion did fill some purpose, right? And the way I look at it is, if you take the account of Genesis, I mean, it's like this is glossed over very quickly here. The scientific aspect of it, just to say, okay, pure science and reason is all you need, and this is where I kind of got this idea from with people pushing that. I'm like, well, the science in the Abrahamic faiths, anyways, God gave you that. God said, you were forbidden to eat the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. It wasn't just the tree of knowledge, right? So the scientific knowledge, God was boasting, like, I made all this, I did all this, so you don't need to know anymore. Worship me because I did all this, right? It's the good and evil part that was denied. So the philosophy, how to think about your existence, how to think about your place in the world, all that, God's saying, okay, you get that from me as well. And that's what was denied to them, because the science he didn't think was important. It was this stuff that he thought was important. So when people leave faiths, especially extreme faiths, I mean, it is a huge void to fill. And, that's why you'll get people believing in the secret and the law of attraction, and people so upset that Donald Trump got elected, or there was whatever. I remember hearing Douglas Murray talking about that in the UK. Someone who's saying because the Tories got elected, there was a reporter who wrote this, that for 2 weeks after the election, I woke up crying for an hour every morning. It's like, politics shouldn't be that important in your life that you're crying for an hour every morning due to the effects of an election. Like people are looking to fill that void with something.
Yeah. Well, there's an interesting.
I certainly think there's something else at play there. Like you said, it's that void. People are looking. People aren't reacting to what's actually happening. They're reacting to, I don't know, like it depends. Like I'm trying to work here with that specific example, but sometimes I don't know. It's just.
Well, there's an interesting. There's an interesting. This is talking about this because I've just haven't actually got the podcast out yet, but I just recorded a new episode of the podcast I do with my co-host Alice Cheshire, and she's the one with all the psychological training, and she's a professional life coach. But what we were talking about is apparently, psychologically speaking, there are a number of things that people who report more subjective happiness, which is the feeling of, like, if I were to ask you, how are you doing on a scale of 1 to 10, you tell me, oh, I'm happy or I'm not happy. There's certain things, commonalities they all seem to have. And some of them you can't really control, like your genetics. If you've got, your genetics predispose you to maybe being a bit happier, or your physical health's a big one. So obviously somebody who's just broken their spine is not going to be as happy as somebody who's, down the gym pumping iron every day. But two of the things that came out were two of the major important factors in people reporting subjective happiness were community and purpose. And one of the major things you lose when you leave the Jehovah's Witnesses, or I'd imagine when you leave Islam, or when you any religion that gave you a huge sense of purpose and gave you a community, then you lose your community and your sense of purpose. It leaves this gaping hole in your life. And one of the things we're talking about in this upcoming episode is how important it is for you to rebuild your community and to find a purpose in life. And I mean, finding a purpose in life is like a big question, but it's like, no, come on, what do you think you want to do? What are you on this earth to do? What do you enjoy doing? What do you get satisfaction for? What kind of, and it's going to be different for every person. Some person is going to be, hey, I just want to have a family and, care for them and I'll be happy as rain. Other people are like, I'm dying to start a business. Other people are like, I want to be an actor. Some people are like, I've actually chatted to someone who's like, genuinely, if Elon Musk was to say to me, we're advertising people to go to Mars for a one-way, it's going to be one way, but you get to go to Mars, they would be like, I'd go. That would be the fulfillment of my life's dream. And I think the thing is like, it's going to be a different answer to everyone, but finding that purpose, don't just drift. I think it's so important for us to do not just drift through life. Go out, work out what makes you happy or what you want to do with the time you've got. Because, we're all on ticking clocks. And, there's an end to everyone's road and we don't know when it is, but it's going to come. So what do you want to fill that time with? And what will make you, when you get to journey's end, what will make you look back and think, yeah, that was, the hours I spent with my life were good hours. Because we're all going to have regrets, but it's like, how do I minimize my regrets and how do I maximize my satisfaction? And when I was a Jehovah's Witness, my purpose was being a witness and looking forward to this wonderful new world with paradise earth where I'd live forever, and essentially doing whatever the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society told me to do. And when I left, one of the purposes I found is ex-JW activism. For me, that's incredibly satisfying, helping other ex-JWs and also, help with the media and governments shining a bit of a spotlight on some of the awful things Jehovah's Witnesses as an organization do. But also I've discovered there's other things I've got going on in my personal life, which are now giving me a huge sense of satisfaction, which I didn't do when I was a Jehovah's Witness because I didn't feel the need to. So I think understanding that we need to have that purpose, we need to, I imagine for you guys as well, doing your podcast and sort of, discussing these issues that come up. I would imagine one of the things is obviously it's something you're doing for society, but I would guess you find a certain personal sense of satisfaction at the end of it. It's like good to know that you've done it and you feel like something's been fulfilled. Would that be?
Yeah, definitely.
Oh, yeah. No, but there's a quote by Carl Sagan, which I really like, which kind of summarizes most of what you just said. And it was, if you want to have a cosmic purpose, find yourself a worthy goal.
Ooh, that's good.
And, Carl Sagan's always gold.
And that's basically all it is. Like what you're saying, it's find yourself something of value and of purpose, and it's don't make it mundane.
And I think,
it's hard to say, but it's finding that purpose, which I think is the hard part for most people. It's you were given this, you were spoon-fed this, you're told that this is your purpose and this is what you have to do, and all the rest, like whatever, like Rabbi Hillel, all the rest is commentary. But yeah, it's that's what you need. It's finding that purpose. That's the hard part.
And certainly for me, I remember as soon as I left Islam, I felt incredibly happy, whereas a lot of people seem to feel really, really depressed and suicidal. I felt the exact opposite. I had felt sad and restricted beforehand, and afterwards, I think one of the key differences between me and a lot of people was that I did set a lot of goals, and leaving Islam sort of opened many doors for me. It opened the door, firstly, to personal decisions. I get to take control of my life. I get to take risks and make those hard decisions that I hadn't been able to before. And essentially direct my own life. And just for me personally, I think it certainly was a major factor in happiness and stability in terms of my journey of leaving faith. But yeah, I think it's great advice.
That's interesting, because just to comment on that point, I mean, leaving the Jehovah's Witnesses was kind of extremely stressful, but for me it was also very exciting. And within a few weeks, I just felt amazing, this amazing sense of freeness, like the world had just opened up. And there was so much possibility and splendor. And it's funny, because one of the things I was going to say is one of the situations I'm in at the moment, and I think this is maybe one of the differences between me and some witnesses who leave and have a really hard time, is I'm not technically shunned, because I did something called fading. Now, officially, as I said before, the Jehovah's Witnesses are supposed to, like, if you leave or if you get thrown out, they're supposed to shun you. But what you can do, is a term that ex-JW use called fading. If you gradually just drift away, and if you, like, ideally, if you move house, so you're out of the area, so none of the local Jehovah's Witnesses know you, and you keep yourself under the radar, it might work and it might not. I mean, my friends don't talk to me anymore, but my family still do, because no one's given no one's actually signed the kill order, if you know what I mean. There hasn't been a green light for the shunning. So my family still talk to me. So I didn't lose my family. Now, that might change at any moment. I am aware that if they found out I was doing this, for example, which is why I'm Covert Fade and not my real name, the shutters would come down. And potentially, if I were to walk in, smoking a cigar and with my girlfriend, who I'm not married to but sleeping with, potentially the shutters could come down. But at the moment, I'm in that equilibrium, so maybe that's another thing that slightly cushioned the blow for me.
It's one of those things.
Well.
I was just saying it's similar for me.
I'm curious. Did you suffer a loss of family when you left? Did you experience that? Or?
For me, my family were really, really getting abusive and threatening.
Wow.
But for a while there, but I kind of refused to let them shun me too hard. Like, there were points where my parents literally kicked me out of home, and I just went and stayed at a Muslim friend's house. And I think that situation kind of embarrassed them to the point where I have non-Muslim family members, like my mom's a convert, and I just said, where am I going to stay? I'm going to stay at their house, and they're going to know exactly how you're treating me. And so for me, it was kind of convenient as well, but also I did kind of maneuver it such that they realized they really didn't have a choice but to keep me around and treat me better, because I was just gonna go down, like I was gonna take the punches and not apologize, essentially. And I really don't think that everyone's in that situation to do that, but I certainly think I've heard of, like, from ex-Muslims who I know who went through really bad breakups with their family, and years later ended up reconciling with them and have something of a relationship with them, which is always better than nothing. And as, I don't know how that applies to everyone, but it certainly helps to consider not burning those bridges, to consider going slow, and not doing anything too bad. For example, I really wasn't doing anything when my family kicked me out, anything like that. And I think eventually they really saw how ridiculous it was that they were reacting in that way, and that they were unjustified in a way. And if I certainly had thought about doing things like going to the local mosque and playing like a porno video on the speakers, but I never went through with anything like that. And instead, I actually volunteered in the Muslim community and helped with charities and started my own organizations that were more liberal and things like that. And I think my parents saw that I was part of this community, that people wanted me. People knew that I was a good person. People sort of knew that whatever they were accusing me of wouldn't be true. And now my family, I'm not even a negative person in my family. My family treats me like anyone else, pretty much.
That's pretty good. I think that's so important, though. I think that what you mentioned about how, because the stereotype amongst, I'm sure it is in Islam and it's definitely in Jehovah's Witnesses, is that people who leave are bad people. The only reason you leave is because you're a bad person. And I think it's so important, if wherever we can, to show that actually, no, people who leave, I mean, the phrase that it's a very loaded word, apostasy, but apostates who leave, they're not bad people. They just don't believe the faith anymore. In fact, they're still good people. They're still the person you remember. And in fact, maybe in some ways they're even better because they don't have a religion telling them to do things that maybe aren't that great, that they don't want to do, but they feel they have to. And I think that's
and the fact that, you know, there's people in my family who, when they have issues with the religion, they know that I'm someone they can turn to. And the fact that I'm someone who doesn't practice the faith, for example, when it's prayer time, I don't go and pray, and I'm the only person who does that. But slowly, people are sort of recognizing that, oh, this guy's covering for us in a way. Like, you know, like there's relatives who are gay, there's relatives who have problems with the anti-feminist sentiment in the Muslim community who have spoken to me. And I don't think any of that would have happened if I hadn't been involved in my family, and but at the same time not pushing it, if that makes sense. So having sort of a strong opinion, but without you know, sort of insulting people, without sort of hurting people's feelings, and knowing where those boundaries are. And it takes some experimentation, I'm sure, but
it's almost like you're negotiating a kind of ceasefire in a way. It's almost like you're finding that balance with your family of like, okay, well, we'll kind of come to an agreement whereby we're in kind of a negotiated sort of truce where I'm not gonna force things on you, and you're not gonna say this to me, and we're kind of we can keep this equilibrium going, because everyone's kind of
becomes like
we're working
after
Yeah, but I mean, it's also like, okay, again, I think, like myself, I think I'm a complete outlier because I didn't even have nearly as much as what Dean was talking about, and, you know, some very distant relations, but these were people I'd never met in my life, so I didn't really care. But I think it comes down to, you're told that this is your way to salvation, and if you associate with these people, that might hinder your chance. So, you know, the people who do shun you, the people who do cut you off, all that, in some ways they're doing it because, okay, well, they want to protect themselves, but at the same time they think, okay, if we shun this person, if we do anything, maybe they'll see the error of their ways and come back, so they're doing it for your benefit as well. So it's
there's a certain
it's almost like
there's there, and I think that love is stronger than whatever bizarre teachings your religion has taught you. Sometimes you know, you might not be lucky enough to have that manifest in your life, but you know, I think it's good sometimes to hold out hope. And
I mean, on that subject, actually, there's a wonderful film that's been released in the UK, and I think it's international, called Apostasy. It's by a director called Daniel Cockatilo, who's a former Jehovah's Witness, and it's about a Jehovah's Witness family who end up having to shun one of their family members. And what that illustrates, and when you were saying about how they shun not only to protect themselves, but also as an act of love to try and get you back, it demonstrates how ultimately, like, these high control religions kind of weaponize family love. They weaponize that love, and so that they think the loving thing to do is to cut you off. Whereas, you know, and what you see this without spoiling it in the film, you see that very much at the time that family love is needed the most for this person, it's withdrawn. And from an organizational point of view, it's so obviously being withdrawn as a control mechanism. But the family members who are doing it think they're doing it for a loving thing, because they're trying to save, you know, the internal salvation of this wayward person is at risk. And it's a film I direct. It's a brilliant film in its own right, but especially if people want an insight into what it's like to be a Jehovah's Witness, it's one of the most fair and balanced films I've seen on that, because it's not a film that says Jehovah's Witnesses are stupid and aren't these people stupid. It's a film that absolutely really cares about these characters. And it's very even-handed. It doesn't force anything down your throat. It just shows what actually goes on. And one of the overriding things it shows you is how Jehovah's Witnesses, but by extension other groups as well, take something that is powerful and good, like familial love, like the love between a mother and a daughter, and weaponize it to turn it into a control mechanism. It's extremely worrying.
Yeah. So all that stuff I was saying before about family love and stuff, it was a bit one-sided as well. Like everything that you said is completely true as well. Even in my experience, there's been plenty of that negative, like I said before, the fact that you rely on these people for everything, the fact that you're dependent on them for all your relationships, it can so easily be turned against you, and that's why it helps to have these X communities. That's why it's so important to have them, as limited as they can be. Just having other people who can walk you through how to live your life, and who can be there when you need someone to talk to or a shoulder to cry on. It's so necessary, really. I do think it'd be great if we could have more exposure of these communities. As Dave was saying before.
But like when you're talking about that documentary, I'd heard about it. I haven't seen it yet, but I think more and more should be done like that, like based on your description of it. Because with a lot of these things, the truth is enough, so you don't really need to embellish. So when someone makes a documentary, and there's nothing that comes to mind, so I'm not saying anyone's really done it, and they over-exaggerate all the bad and the harm.
Yeah.
There's no real need to do that. I mean, the truth in itself is bad enough, or should be enough to show you what it's like, and then that way you can't get accused of, okay, well, you're making this stuff up. You're not, like they're the one thing I think of. It's a silly thing, but and I think it came out because of some movie in the 80s, and they talked about like how Orthodox Jews or Hasidic Jews, even married couples, when they had sex, they would cut a hole in the cloth, and they would use that hole to have sex with, even though, and it was okay. It's not true. But like, you don't need to put that kind of stuff in it. The truth of it is bad enough.
Yeah.
And so hopefully, like we were talking about this earlier, there's the documentary about Hasidic Jews called One of Us on Netflix. That's also very, very well done.
Yeah.
And I think you're absolutely right, because the other thing is that the kind of the believers who are still in, they're looking for a reason to discredit whatever's said in a documentary or a film or a novel or anything. So if we embellish it or like say things that are not true, they can leap on that as a reason to dismiss everything.
Yeah.
And that's why it's so important to get as much as is possible, as humanly possible. And there's always going to be like mistakes or a slight inaccuracy, because it's just inevitable, because nothing's perfect. But I think, as what you're saying, it's so important to stay away from embellishment, because sticking to the truth is bad enough. And if you're sticking to the truth, then that say, for example, that Jehovah's Witness or that Muslim isn't able to say you're lying. What they have to say, they have to start justifying what's in there. So like a Jehovah's Witness who watches Apostasy, they won't be able to say, well, that's a bunch of lies. What they'll have to be able to say is, oh, okay, we do that, but there's reasons for it. And it's, it changes the tenor of the conversation. And it also, I mean, like I said, one of the reasons I woke up from my indoctrination as a Jehovah's Witness was that I found out my religion had been exaggerating and lying and twisting the words of scientists. So if I was myself, both from a moral perspective and also from a tactical perspective, I can't now, as an ex-Jehovah's Witness, embellish and twist and lie what's going on within Watchtower, because I will be committing the same ethical crimes that brought me out of that religion in the first place. Exactly. So you've got to kind of take the high road with these things, I think.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, like in Islam, there's a lot of people who speak out against, like when Christians, for example, speak out about Islam, and they talk about how Muslims are taught to lie to non-Muslims. I forget what the word is. Because we're literally not taught that.
Okay, yeah, taqiyya.
Taqiyya, yeah. We're literally, like, almost no Muslims, except for like a very, very small minority, don't even know about it. And so when you hear things like that as a Muslim, even if you find a lot of their other arguments convincing, you end up losing faith in them and thinking, oh, this guy's not reliable, really. He doesn't know what the hell he's talking about. So certainly.
Yeah, taqiyya is a bit of a red flag when it comes up, because, okay, it is there, and it says if you're in the land of the unbelievers, you can you can lie about your faith to protect yourself, but it was used mainly by Shias when they were in Sunni communities, and even among Shias. But I mean, I hadn't heard the term until like 2013. I'd never
but
even
it was
heard.
I only heard about it in terms of if someone is about to kill you, you can lie.
But getting back to the sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to quickly say what another commonality there is. The Jehovah's Witnesses have something called Theocratic warfare strategy, which amounts to the same thing, but most JWs don't even know about it. And it's very rarely, it's used, the leadership use it when they're in court, basically, to justify lying to court. And there's a whole laundry list of times that Watchtower officials have been caught point blank lying to the judge, and they justify it saying it's Theocratic warfare strategy. But most witnesses don't know about it and don't even use it. And again, so it sounds like it's a similar thing. It's like, yeah, it happens, but it's like really not this prevalent doctrine of deceit that permeates the entire religion. Yeah. Most Jehovah's Witnesses haven't even heard of it.
Well, here, I can piss off both faiths right now. There's a title of a book about the Mossad that came out in the late 80s or the early 90s, and the title of the book was By Way of Deception. And it's like a saying, like, by way of deception shall we make war. So, getting back to the science thing, because that was kind of what spurred me on. With me, like the first inconsistency I saw was I was about 11, and we'd heard about, I'd learned about the sun burning up in 5 billion years, and I was trying to equate that to the Day of Judgment. I'm like, well, the two don't match, right? So which is it? And that's kind of what let me down my primrose path. But, I can give you a list of things that are scientifically inaccurate in the Quran, like the sun setting in a puddle of mud, or the sperm being formed between the backbone and the ribs, and other things like that, which obviously aren't true. But I mean, Sam Harris had brought this up a long time ago when he was talking about abortion and stem cells, and he said, okay, if you look at Judaism and Christianity, the moment of inception, the soul gets put in the zygote, right? Whereas in Islam, it's like 140 days. So there would be no issue in Islam with having stem cells or doing stem cell research, right? Maybe for other reasons, but not specifically because the soul has already embodied it's all like the fertilized egg has already got the soul in it, right? So, I mean, you hear about the blood transfusions, you can't do those. But what about, let's say you needed a kidney transplant or a liver transplant? Is that allowed, or is that...
So, welcome to the wonderful world of Jehovah's Witness doctrine, which changes every 5 to 10 years. And this is one of the weird things with JWs, is they will flip certain teachings on their head, and then everyone is expected to flip with it, and no one is expected to have a problem with it. And one of the things with transplants, I'll take you through the brief history. So, and I'm not going to be able to do the dates are going to be vague because I can't recall them off the top of my head. But if you go to jwfacts.com and look up blood transfusions and transplants, all of the literature, the timelines are there. So they started off being fine with everything. Then in the 1940s, they started, I believe it was in the 1940s, they started to they banned blood transfusions and transplants on the grounds they were cannibalism. Then they, and as this went along, they started to also say that, if you have a transplant, you'll get the personality of the donor, and they're on record as having that written down in their being said from the platforms and also in their literature. There's someone who got a heart transplant, woke up with someone else's personality. It's like, really, can I be transplanted with the heart of Jeff Bezos so I become like a multimillionaire, please? Then they changed it. And they changed it so that you could have transplants, but you couldn't have blood transfusions. So, and everyone's expected to now accept that, and no one's expected to ask, well, what about all the people who died because they refused transplants? And then they changed the blood doctrine. So now they used to say no blood at all. And about 15 years ago, I think it's about 15 years ago, they changed it so that you could have what they defined as blood fractions. Now, the way they define fractions is scientifically illiterate. It's not like they sort of say you can't have plasma, you can't have white blood, you can't have red blood, and you can't have what the other thing is. It platelets, but there are other, like if you break it down even more, you can have some parts of that. And again, I'm not are completely au fait on the details, but apparently if you look at the way blood is constructed, that's not a logical way to break it down. It like makes no sense whatsoever. And their reasoning for that is if you break something down long enough, it's not blood anymore. But it's very arbitrary. It makes no sense. And again, you have to ask, okay, so what about all the people who died before you eased the restrictions up a bit? But you're not, as a witness, you're not expected to ask that question. You're just expected to accept the new light. They call this new light. And this doesn't just extend to blood transfusions. This extends to prophecy. So, and I'm not going to go into JW prophecy because it goes on forever, but they predict the end of the world in here are some of the predictions for the end of the world. 1914, 1925, 1975, before the end of the 20th century, before the people who saw World War I die, and now they're just like, yeah, whenever. Actually, although there is actually the current explanation is hilarious. It's called the overlapping generation. And again, if people are curious, you can Google Jehovah's Witnesses overlapping generation or look it up on JW Facts or JW Survey. It makes no sense, but it makes no sense to a degree, which is actually hysterically funny. But the point is that they are constantly changing all their teachings and also sort of what you are and aren't allowed to do, and you're just expected to get in line with it instantly. And if you don't, you're in trouble. And it's almost like there's a movie called Equilibrium. It's got Christian Bale in it, and I like it. It's kind of a bit of a goofy movie, but I like it because Christian Bale kind of jumps around and shoots guns and looks cool. But there's a line in it it's this dystopian future where everyone is just expected to comply, and Christian Bale's character is given these orders that seem to contradict with what he's been previously told. And he questions it, and his superior tells him, "What you must understand, it is not the order that's important, it's our obedience to it."
Yeah.
And that is Jehovah's Witnesses to a T. It doesn't matter if we change everything about this religion the next day. What matters is you do as we say.
I liked Equilibrium, but I found it, I mean, a little off topic here, but I found it a bit, it reminded me far too much of Fahrenheit 451.
Yeah.
And it was, I mean, it was a bit of a ripoff. But yeah, no, but
it's a gunned up Fahrenheit 451, basically.
But what you're saying, it's, it doesn't matter what the doctrine is. It's the content of the doctrine isn't important. It's you believe the framework of it, right? It was like with Catholics up until, I can't remember when it was. I think it was in 2000 even, where Pope John Paul II, he said that limbo doesn't really exist. But, from the time of Augustine up until John Paul, like how many people were, grieving their children stuck in limbo because they died before baptism. Like the suffering you caused on these parents. So it's great of you to say, okay, well, guess what? We were wrong. But, there's no apology for the years of grief and anguish. And it's just, I mean, I remember hearing things when I was a kid, like just silly little things, because people would come up with these weird fatwas. And like Dean was saying earlier, that's the one thing with Islam. There is no clergy. It's not a cohesive thing, except for like maybe Shias, where you have the imams, and they call them the 12ers. They're waiting for the 12th imam. But so we would hear things from the local mosque, like you can't. And in Montreal at the time, there was only a couple, so there wasn't. You didn't have a lot of authority, but you can't eat cheese because it has rennet in it, and rennet is made from the enzyme of animals, so it couldn't be halal. And it's like, what? Yeah. I can't eat cheese? I remember moving to Vancouver in my mid-20s, and if I'm making Indian food, like I grew up in India, I was born in India, so I eat a lot of Indian food. But if I'm making Indian food, I like using halal meat. I find it just tastes better. So I was going to get some, and then I also like calf's brains, so I asked for calf's brains at the halal butcher shop, and he told me that even if it was a halal animal, the brain can never be halal because it sits in blood. And I'm like, what?
What?
I don't know, but where did this come from?
I've never heard that.
Yeah, so I mean, it's like arbitrarily making decisions that are still 20 years behind the conventional mores.
That always annoyed me too, because in Islam, like, it's not like Jehovah's Witnesses or the Catholic Church or whatever. There's no such, like, it's meant to be static. It's meant to be one message for all time, unchanging, and yet you find that. I found anyway that there were plenty of, when I was Muslim, I found things, especially pertaining to food, for some reason that seems to be one of these things that they just jump around a lot with. I remember one time in particular, a Turkish friend of mine told me, go to any chef and ask them if the chicken in Australia is halal because it is a land of Christianity. And I did that. I went to chefs all over the place. Well, like 2 chefs actually, and I asked them, is all the chicken halal because it's the land of the Christians? And they said yes. But then I was like, okay, then why do you teach that it's not? And they were like, well, it's just generally considered better to not do it, and so we teach. And it's like, wait, what? So we're allowed to eat this food, but everyone acts like it's not halal. And then there's these weird like cultural like niches where everyone eats whatever the hell they feel like because they're actually more enlightened apparently. And it's like, I don't know, that confused the hell out of me when I was. Yeah, and it was annoying too. It was like everyone's just doing what they feel like, and then there's people in charge telling you what to do. Like, yeah, it is one of the most frustrating things.
Yeah, and that's I think that's part of the annoyance, especially one of the things that actually led me to leave the Jehovah's Witnesses is I was a big believer in not going beyond the things written and not going beyond what you're scripturally mandated to do. And that's actually, it's supposed to be quite a key Jehovah's Witness doctrine, is you don't go beyond what's in the Bible. But I was more and more seeing the people who run the organization, the governing body, and these other people just pulling rules out of their ass and just justifying them with the flimsiest like scripture that could no way. And it just got to me more and more. It's like, this is the one thing we're not supposed to be doing, and you're doing it with cheerful abandon. And it's so obvious that you're just grinding your own personal. This person has a personal problem with this, so they just decided to ban it for everybody, like some complete killjoy jerk.
Like your suspicions that this is being controlled by individuals who are hungry for control.
Yeah.
Maybe they don't even know about it, but they are controlling the community. And everyone's just geared up and following along. And you realize, I was talking about this with a friend recently, how the Bible, the Bible and the Quran can never be perfect because, perfectly understood, because it's always going to be subjective. Even if we go to an English class, for example, and you're reading Catcher in the Rye, and your teacher asks you, why is the curtains red in this scene? And you say, I don't know, it represents love. And the teacher says, no, it represents death. And that kind of thing happens even though there's a perfect translation of the exact same language happens. Whereas with the Bible and the Quran, no one knows what the hell it's meant to mean. And
which version of the text? And which version of the text do which million versions of this that have been passed down and changed and
I mean that was frustrating. But that, at least in one way, the Bible and the Torah have some leeway now that the Quran doesn't, because I mean up until I'd say even 50 years ago, maybe not so much with the Bible and the Torah, it was not thought to be divine scripture, it was thought to be divinely inspired scripture, whereas with the Quran, it is the unalterable, unerrant word of God, right? It is not divinely inspired, it is divine. The text in itself is divine, so but then they still have room to wiggle, and they find different interpretations, like so. And you were talking about all the
language is inherently symbolic. Yeah. It means whatever the hell you want it to mean. Yeah. Really.
But, no, when you're talking about different versions, right? Not a lot of people know this, but I think there's, even with what they call the Cairo interpretation, which is what most Sunnis use, but there's something like 14 different versions of the Quran out there right now, and they're all slightly different.
Yeah. Oh wow.
Slight. Yeah.
But
I think it was wrecked. It was like the one version was sort of consolidated a long time, like very, very close to after Muhammad was died.
Well, if you look at the chain of it with the Quran, sorry again, we're going to get off a little bit off tangent here, but Uthman was the first person who codified it, and basically what he did was he was finding people, like what they were called the Hunafa, the ones who've memorized it. So there was less and less of them about because of all the wars. They were dying off. So he gathered together everyone who had said they'd memorized it or memorized passages of it, and every scrap of paper and bone and clay tablet or whatever, anything that had any of the any of it recorded. He brought it all together, codified it initially, and then burned every other copy that was out there. Then after him, it was the I want to say the Abbasid Empire, so it was a couple of 100 years after him, or 150 years after him. That was done, and they did the same thing. And then this was done a couple of times. I don't know all the chain, but then, like I said, there was one version which is called the Cairo version right now, which I think was officially adopted in the early 1900s, and that's basically the generic Sunni Quran. But then again, like I said, there are about 14 different versions, so you're not quite sure. If you want, I'll look up I just actually saw something on this. If I can find the video, I'll send it to you guys. It goes into it in just a lot more detail than I just did there. I don't want to take up too much more of your time, Covert. I mean, like, you're being very gracious with it. Is there anything else you'd like to talk about? And then maybe we can start wrapping up. And if you wanted to give out your social media and stuff like that. And if you send me links to any of those pages that you'd been discussing, like I know I have the JW survey and the JW facts, but if you have anything else like that, if you send it to me, I'll put them in the description. But like I said, if you have anything else you'd like to talk about or bring up.
I think just generally the one thing I'd say is that, and this is kind of what I've tried to do now with the JW Forwardcast, is that I found there's so many good resources out there to help people leave the Jehovah's Witnesses. But what I found is that there is some stuff there for what happens after, but like a lot of the stuff we were talking about, like the importance of getting a community back or finding purpose, or how do you one of the things we focus on is like, how do you undo the damage that was done to you in terms of your thinking and your emotions and the way you view life? And I think that's one of the things as exes from any religion, it's great that we're out and it's great that we're here, but I think we need to recognize that there's probably a lot of work we still need to do to kind of like unlearn a lifetime of bad habits from our previous religion. And I was curious, so I was going to ask you guys if you want to come on the Forwardcast at a future point to discuss this, but I wanted to ask you both quickly, what do you think what was the hardest habit to lose religiously? Or like, what was the one habit that was ingrained into you that you realized, oh crap, I still do, even though I've left the religion, I'm still acting religiously in this aspect and I have to get rid of it?
Okay, with me, I'm going to have to say 0 because I was rebellious from day one. When I started questioning around 11, that was it. It just slowly, the shimmer started fading off of it, and I stopped believing at 16. I'm 49 now, so I've had plenty of years of practice. I don't, there's nothing that I've kept really.
You've done a full cleanse.
Yeah, I mean, for a lot of people I know, it's actually the pork thing, and even like if they were practicing, they would say they were still practicing, but they would break every other taboo, but not the pork thing.
Yeah, I think it's the same for me. I eat bacon, but the smell of pork just feels wrong to me.
Interesting.
It's that particular smell. I don't know why. It just seems haram.
Well, I've heard firefighters say that this, and actually, sorry, I shouldn't say I heard this. I read, I think Hitchens wrote about this in God Is Not Great, how firefighters describe the smell of burning flesh almost like the smell of cooking pig, and that's maybe why.
Well, apparently we're very close to pigs. Apparently, when they do transplants, they can put pig valves into human hearts. So it's a bit like, maybe that's like subconsciously it's a bit too close to cannibalism.
Yeah. But well, for me, I like in terms of habit, I'd actually have to think about it. But I think for me, there's habits that I still haven't broken, and I don't really need to. Like, for example, like I sing a lot of nasheeds in the car. Like, if I'm by myself going to work, I'll just start reciting Quran sometimes, just because it used to be a habit that I got into because, I thought the more Quran I recite, the better. And now it's just something I do, and it's just, I don't know, I just do it.
Oh, wow.
I just forget that I don't believe in it.
I think for me, I mean, if you guys are up for it, I'd love to get you on my show at a later date and discuss this.
Anytime, please. I'd be happy.
Yeah, I'd love to.
I mean, for me, the one thing I'd say is I realized I was still asking everyone for permission to do things, because as a Jehovah's Witness, you're constantly asking people permission to do things that you should just be able to decide yourself. So that's one thing I really had to realize. Oh crap! Why am I asking other people for permission to make life decisions that I should just be able to do because I'm an adult? And it was I just realized one day, I'd be a year after waking up, I was doing it. I was like, holy crap! So that would be mine. So yeah, I'm going to have to jump off in about 5 minutes. So if I just if I do the blatant self-promotion thing.
Right ahead.
Give you.
Yeah, go ahead.
So you can find me on Twitter at Covert Fade. You can also find me on YouTube at Covert Fade as well, where I have there's some podcasts, but also some extra content on there. The podcast I host is with my co-host Alice Cheshire. She's an ex-Jehovah's Witness. She's trained in psychology, and she's also a life coach. So she's kind of the brains, and I'm just the mouth. But we discuss issues that tend to affect exes of all religions. Well, at the moment we're focusing on Jehovah's Witnesses, but we do want to cast it further to kind of focus on rebuilding after you leave and how to do that. You can also find me on JW Survey. I'm the editor there, and I write with the JW Survey team. We write articles about what's going on with Jehovah's Witnesses. Where else can you find me? I think that's everything. But yeah, guys, I just want to say thanks so much for having me on the podcast. It's really fascinating, like you say, to see the similarities that exist between all these different religions. It's like the underlying mechanics of how they get you are all very similar, it seems to be.
Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah, no, thank you. It was you're so eloquent in describing, the all these concepts, and I'd love to listen to your podcast after this. When's it coming out?
So we've got we're already up, so you can find us on iTunes. If you type JW Forwardcast into iTunes or Podbean, you'll find us there. We've got 7 episodes up at the moment, and I'm working on the 8th, which discusses some of the stuff we've been discussing now. And then I'd love to if after the show maybe we can sort out a time to get you guys on in the next couple of months.
For sure.
That'd be awesome. Yep.
And
Cool.
thanks very much for coming on, and thank you to everyone to listen. And we will be back shortly. And thanks again. So I'll speak to you all later.